Hey guys, it's Maria, and I just wanted to take a minute today to talk to you about some vocabulary that people tend to question about and ask about. And let's kind of go over a few of these things. And one of the things that I want to say about the PrepAgent flashcards, if you guys aren't using the flashcards, I encourage you to sit down and take some time to play around with these flashcards. This is an incredible resource to study with, and here's why. When I talk to students, there are a lot of times they say things like, well, Maria, I think I know what that means, that word, that term means. However, I need to see it in a question. And if it was a multiple choice, I could tell you. And that's fine in some circumstances, but the true understanding of a word is something that we can just pull from our memory bank. We don't have to see it in context. We don't have to worry about what it says in the question. If we know it without even having to pull it out of the context of the question, taking this test will be so much easier for you because you've already got a firm grasp of what that word means or what that term means. And you don't have to sit and try to decipher, well, I think it means this, or I think it means that. If you can do flashcards and you can define these terms, you're going to do so much better when you get to the test, because you're going to feel confident that you know the word. And then if they change the context of the question and use the word somewhere else, if you know that word inside and out, it's going to make that question so much easier for you. So let's kind of talk about a few. I'm going to just kind of scroll through some of these because there are certain things I want to talk about and get to today, and certain words that we'll save for another day. But when you're doing the flashcards, I encourage you to try to go through each one individually and see how well you do, which ones you know and what you don't know. And if you find that you don't know a word, make a note of that and spend some time maybe rereading your part of the book that deals with that topic, or watching one of the videos of one of the past webinars that are on that topic in PrepAgent. Those are great resources too. And think about that term or that word deeply before your test comes to pass. So for example, today, if I see this term FHA, so what is FHA? What do I know about FHA? So if I ask myself that question, I'd say, first of all, how much is my minimum down payment on FHA? That's important for finance questions. Sometimes they might ask me about that. And remember, my minimum down payment on FHA is 3.5%. What else do I know about FHA? Well, the money for an FHA loan comes from the lender, but the government is involved in that they insure the loan, right? So the government insures FHA loans, and the minimum down payment on them is 3.5%. And the reason the government insures those loans is so that the lender doesn't risk as much when they make us the loan at that low down payment amount of a loss, because that insurance will come in and help them out if they have to foreclose on us. All right, so what does PrepAgent say about FHA? The Federal Housing Administration was created by the National Housing Act of 1934 with the intention of regulating the rate of interest in the terms of mortgages that it insured in order to make home ownership more accessible. Because if a person doesn't have to have the traditional 20% down that we have to have in a conventional loan, instead has to have a much lower down payment, that opens up home ownership to a lot more people, and that keeps the mortgage market and the housing market flowing, and it's good for everybody. So a net lease, so think about a net lease. Now, I always tell people, think that you're caught in a net with your landlord here, and you've got to pay for everything. So a net lease basically is a lease, usually this is in commercial, where I, as the tenant, am going to pay for things like the property taxes, the property insurance, the maintenance on the building, things that a landlord would generally pay for, I'm agreeing to pay for, and that's called a net lease. Like I said, that's usually in commercial. So they say here, also known as a triple net lease. This is a lease in which the tenant pays for taxes, insurance, and maintenance, in addition to other fees like rent and utilities. So there you go. I knew what that was without having to see it in the context of a multiple choice question, because I've got this term memorized. And I don't expect all of you to have every term memorized because you don't talk about it all day like I do. But you should know a lot of these terms as you practice some. The more you practice, the more you'll feel confident that you can recall them from your memory. Let's see. Let's talk about something else important. A cloud on the title. Well, we know a cloud, if you think about a cloudy sky, that's an unpleasant thing, right? We want to have a bright and sunny day. If we have a cloud on our title, we've got a problem. There's something on the title that's making it that's causing a problem that we're going to try to remove, hopefully, before we close on the house. So they tell us the cloud on title is a defect in title. For an example, an unreleased lien or an encumbrance that might invalidate or impair a title. Say that I'd paid off my mortgage, but there was still a lien that the lender had never released on the property. Well, that's a problem, right? Because if I sell it to the next person, there's a lien hanging around that shouldn't be there. So that's a cloud on title. We would have to resolve that, or we would want to resolve that before we sold the home. So see, again, I knew what that was from my memory, and you can know what it is too if you practice these a little bit. All right, let's talk about an acknowledgement. What is an acknowledgement? This is one that we don't necessarily spend a lot of time on in our practice questions, but it's good to know. An acknowledgement is when I sign something in front of a notary or an official person like a notary. So usually it's a notary that I sign this document in front of, and that's called an acknowledgement. So if I go to the closing table and I sign a bunch of documents at the closing and they notarize them, that's an acknowledgement. So what does PrepAgent say? A declaration made by a person to a notary public or other public official authorized to take acknowledgements that an instrument was executed by him or her as a free and voluntary act. So here's another word in this definition. So even in our definition, we have some key terms we need to talk about. What the heck is an instrument? And an instrument is just a document, right? An instrument's a document. A deed is an instrument. Anything that we're going to sign like that, that's going to be an instrument, okay? Blanket mortgage. Let's say I'm an investor or a developer and I've got a bunch of properties and I want to take one big loan out. I don't want to go out and do individual loans on everything that I own because that would be expensive and time consuming and just a general pain. So what do I want to do here? I want to take out a blanket mortgage where I pledge a bunch of properties as collateral for one debt, one mortgage, right? And as I pay that mortgage down, a lot of times they'll release certain pieces of that collateral so that I can sell them or do what I want with them as I get the mortgage paid back. They don't need as much collateral. A lot of times developers do this sort of thing. So a blanket mortgage, what do they say? Blanket mortgage is a mortgage that covers more than one parcel of real estate. It provides for each parcel's partial release, that's a tongue twister, from the mortgage lien on repayment of a definite portion of the debt. All right. Sorry, let's find one that's really good for us here. A beneficiary. So if I live in a state that does deed of trust, I know that the lender, the term for the lender in a state that does a deed of trust is a beneficiary. But do I also know the other terms that have to do with deed of trust? What about a trustor? Who's the trustor in a deed of trust? That's the borrower, right? Who's the guy who hangs on to my deed to make sure everything goes well until the end when I get it paid back? That's the trustee. And the lender is the beneficiary. So the trustor is the borrower. The trustee is holding on to the deed. He's the third party holding on to the deed until the loan gets paid off. Then when I pay it off, he's going to give it back to me. And then remember, that's called a deed of reconveyance. And then the beneficiary is the lender at the end. He's the guy loaning me the money. So entity that loans the money and secures the loan via deed of trust. Once a loan is paid in full, the beneficiary issues a request of reconveyance and the trustee issues a reconveyance deed. See, when I was talking about this, these are the key things that came to my mind. And they define it here that way. A beneficiary statement is a document in which the lender provides the present balance of a loan. So how much I still owe is going to be in my beneficiary statement. Okay, now I've gone ahead and shown you the definition of avoidable contract because I want you to read this before I talk more about it. So let's talk about the true definition, and then I'm going to give you some examples. Voidable contract is a contract that can be rejected at a later date for a specific reason. For example, contracts signed under duress, contracts entered into with threat or menace, or contracts entered into with a minor. This is a question on the test that I know a lot of people tell me freaks them out. They're like, what do I do here? How do I know the difference between void and voidable, right? So let's talk about that for just a minute, and that'll be the last. This will be the last kind of thing that we'll do today, but I want to switch over and show you my whiteboard so that I can talk about these things with you. Now, if I have a valid contract, one that isn't void, it has to have 4 things, right? So it has to have competent parties. That's important. So I have to have competent parties. Everybody has to be, as I joke, sane and sober, right? We all have to know what we're entering into and understand it. That's one of the elements of a valid contract. If we're missing that, then the contract is just plain void, not voidable. So number 2, we have to have consideration. Oops, I'm a terrible typer, by the way, you guys, sorry. So consideration, I make a promise to you and you make a promise back to me. That's our consideration. In a real estate contract, a good example of consideration would be, I promise to pay you $300,000 for your house and you promise to sell it to me for $300,000. That's consideration, okay? We're swapping a promise to each other. Number 3, we have to have, it has to have a legal purpose, right? Now, so sometimes they use an extreme example of like, well, if we agree to rob a bank together and then we don't rob the bank together, we can't enforce the contract because that doesn't have a legal purpose. And that's a pretty extreme example. Most of us aren't running around making bank robbery contracts with our colleagues, but in real estate, this could be this, and this is the example I always use. If I want to buy a really neat old mansion on the hill from you, and I say, well, I love your beautiful mansion, and you say, thank you very much, and I say, let's make a deal and I'll buy it from you, and you say, okay. And I put in the contract that the purpose of my purchase of your beautiful mansion is to use it as a bed and breakfast. And you have no idea. You've never wanted to open a bed and breakfast. You're like, fine with me, do what you want. So we put the contract together, but we find out a week later that the zoning won't allow me to have a bed and breakfast in your beautiful mansion. They're just not going to let me have that. In that case, that contract would not be valid. It would be void because we are lacking a legal purpose. We can't accomplish what the contract asks us to do. So it would just be plain old void. And number 4, we have to have a meeting of the minds. And sometimes we call this mutual agreement. We have to agree on everything that's happening there. We have to say, okay, our minds have met. If we're still bickering over whether or not you're going to leave your refrigerator, we don't have a contract yet. We're still negotiating. But once everything's said and done, and we have a meeting of the minds and a mutual agreement on everything in that contract, then we have a valid contract. If we're missing any of these 4 things, it's just plain void, okay? Just plain void. So remember that. If you have those 4 things memorized, it will help you decipher those types of test questions, usually in your contract section. But what about this? Let's go over here and call it voidable. So let's remember what our definition of voidable told us on our flashcard, that it's something that came under some kind of a strange situation, that usually something happened there that it's no longer a completely, it's going to be a voidable contract. Let me think of the best way to say this. So let's go back to our definition here. Let me switch back here. And now let's look at voidable. So we've got a valid contract. We've got all 4 of our elements that we went over. But then if we have a voidable contract, it says that it can be rejected at a later date for a specific reason. So it's valid, but we can still reject it. So what we say here is that the injured party, the person who had something unpleasant happen to them, can make the choice of whether or not they're going to consider this contract void or valid, whether they're going to move forward with it. If it's voidable, they can say, I'm not moving forward with this valid contract. I'm voiding it because something happened during the formation, usually, of the contract. So for example, if I tell you, signed under duress or threat or menace, if I tell you, hey, listen, I need you to sign this, and if you don't, I'm going to tie you up and throw you in the basement, and you better do it. And you're like, oh gosh, Maria's a crazy person. I'm going to go ahead and sign this contract to get her the heck out of my house. This is nuts, right? So you sign it. Now we still have our 4 elements there. We have competent parties, we have mutual agreement, we have legal purpose, we have consideration. You've signed off on all that, but you did it without having a real free will to do so. So later on, after I leave, you could say, gosh, you know, that was nuts. I'm going to void this contract. I'm going to not move forward with it. I'm going to reject it because it was put to me in a really negative way and I don't feel comfortable. And they would probably allow you to do that. However, you can say, even though Maria is a crazy person and she threatened to put me in the basement and tie me up if I didn't sign, I like the contract and I'm going to hold her to it. So the choice is yours as the injured party. You can choose to hold me to it, or you can back out of the deal. Another one, this is a common one that everybody argues about. And before I say this, I will tell you that I understand when I'm making this statement that in some states that you have to be 18 or whatever age it may be to enter into a valid contract. This is a national type question that I'm talking about here. So let's assume that that's not an issue, that the age of the person is not an issue for the question. This is not for the state laws, but just in general. Let's say that I'm 17 and a half years old and I sign a contract with you, an adult. Now, you are the adult there. It's kind of up to you to determine whether or not the person you're entering into with the contract is a minor or not, but you didn't bother, you didn't find out. So you signed this contract with me and I'm 17 and a half. Do I have to move forward? And the answer is no. As a minor, I can void the contract, say I'm not doing this. That's a voidable contract because the person who you're contracting with is underage at the time they sign it. They're the injured party. However, if I decide that I want to hold you to it, I can. That's my choice as the minor. Another common question people ask is, well, what if the person's 17 and a half and before the contract closes, they turn 18. Now they're an adult. Are they now stuck with the contract? And the answer is no. The person who is the injured party, the minor there, it depends on when they entered into the contract, not when it closes. So even if they turn 18, while the contract is still in play before it closes, they can still treat that as a voidable contract. I hope this helps you out today, guys. I'll do some more of these flashcards if that helps you.